You did something wrong today. Or maybe you didn't. Maybe you just existed in a way that took up slightly more space than usual. Maybe you said no to something. Maybe you asked for something. Maybe you simply had a need, and somewhere in the hours that followed, the guilt arrived. Not because you harmed anyone, not because any reasonable assessment of the situation would support it, just guilt. A low, persistent hum of having done something wrong that you cannot quite locate. If that's you, you are not overly sensitive. You are not dramatic. You are not someone who manufactures problems where none exist. You are someone whose guilt response was calibrated in an environment that required it to be permanently switched on. And once you understand that, the guilt loses a little of its authority. Let's start with what guilt actually is, because guilt, in its healthy form, is a useful signal. It is the emotional response to having done something that conflicts with your values. It is specific, it is proportionate, it points at something real, and it motivates repair. This is healthy guilt. It shows up when you've actually caused harm. It tells you something true, and when you address it, when you repair, apologize, or adjust, it fades. What you are experiencing is something different. Psychologists call it chronic guilt or free-floating guilt, guilt that is not attached to a specific wrong.
Guilt that is not proportionate to any actual harm. Guilt that does not fade when you address it because there is nothing specific to address. It is guilt as a baseline state, a permanent low-level sense of having fallen short of something, somewhere, somehow. Now here's where it comes from. Because chronic guilt almost never develops in adults. It is almost always installed in childhood, in environments where your needs, your wants, your preferences, your presence were regularly framed as problems, where asking was an imposition, where saying no was selfish, where taking up space, emotional, physical, relational space, required justification. In those environments, you learned something fundamental. Your existence creates burden. Having needs is wrong, wanting things is selfish, and the appropriate response to your own existence is a kind of preemptive apology. The guilt is that apology, running constantly, covering every moment in which you might have taken up too much space. There is also a second origin that is less about what was said and more about what was felt. Some people grew up with a parent or caregiver who carried a great deal of distress, depression, anxiety, unhappiness that filled the room. And as a child, you felt responsible for that distress, not because anyone told you that you were, but because children are egocentric in the most literal developmental sense. They place themselves at the center of events. If something is wrong in the house, the child's first instinct is to ask, "Is this because of me?" And if the distress was chronic and unexplained, the answer the child arrived at was often yes. Somehow, in some way I don't fully understand, this is my fault. And so the guilt formed, not from having done something wrong, but from having absorbed the emotional atmosphere of a space and concluded that you were its cause. Now here's what chronic guilt actually does, and it does more damage than most people realize. The first thing it does is make every decision harder, because every decision that involves your own preferences, what you want, what you need, what would make you happy, has to pass through the guilt filter. Is this selfish? Am I taking too much? Does this make me a bad person? The guilt doesn't wait for evidence before answering. It answers immediately, and it almost always answers yes, which means that even small acts of self-determination, choosing what to eat, deciding how to spend your evening, saying no to one thing in order to say yes to another, carry a weight they were never supposed to carry. The second thing chronic guilt does is make you permanently available, because if you feel guilty for having needs, you compensate by trying to ensure that everyone else's needs are met. You say yes when you mean no, you help when you're exhausted, you give what you don't have, and you frame all of this as generosity when actually it is guilt management. The giving is real, but the driver isn't love. It's the relief of not feeling guilty for a moment. The third thing chronic guilt does is make genuine rest impossible, because rest requires the belief that you deserve it, that your well-being matters, that it is acceptable to stop producing, stop helping, stop being useful for a period of time. And if your guilt tells you that your existence requires justification through usefulness, then the moment you stop being useful, the guilt activates.
Rest becomes something you have to earn, and no matter how much you earn it, the guilt will find a reason to tell you you haven't. Now here's something worth understanding about the relationship between chronic guilt and anger, because they are more closely connected than most people expect. Chronic guilt is, at its root, an internalized belief that your needs are less important than other people's. And when you consistently subordinate your needs to others, when you say yes when you mean no, give when you have nothing left, apologize for existing, resentment builds. Not toward the people you're helping, toward yourself, for continuing to participate in a system that costs you so much. The guilt and the resentment feed each other. The guilt drives the giving generates resentment, the resentment generates more guilt, and the cycle runs. So what actually helps? First, learn to distinguish between signal guilt and noise guilt. Signal guilt is specific. It points at something real. It arrived after an actual action that conflicted with your actual values. Noise guilt is vague. It is a general atmosphere of wrongness rather than a specific accusation. It arrived without a clear cause. When guilt arrives, ask, what specifically did I do wrong? If you can identify a real action, a real harm, a real conflict with your values, address it. If you cannot, if the guilt is there but the wrong is not, that is noise. And noise does not require a response. It requires recognition. Second, practice completing the sentence, I feel guilty for, and see what comes out. Often, when people with chronic guilt do this, they find themselves writing things like, I feel guilty for taking time for myself. I feel guilty for saying no. I feel guilty for having a preference. I feel guilty for not being available. I feel guilty for needing something. Reading these sentences back is sometimes enough to see how illegitimate the guilt is. Because written down in plain language, these are not wrongs. These are needs. These are rights. These are things every person is allowed. Third, understand that feeling guilty is not the same as being guilty. The feeling is real. The verdict it carries is not automatically true. Your guilt has been running so long and so automatically that it has acquired a false authority. It speaks in the voice of truth. It sounds like clear-eyed self-assessment, but it is not. It is an old alarm built for an old environment, still going off in rooms where the danger it was designed for no longer exists. You are not guilty of existing. You are not guilty of having needs. You are not guilty of occasionally prioritizing yourself. You are not guilty of the things chronic guilt has been convicting you of. The guilt is not evidence, it is a habit. And habits, even very old ones, can be unlearned. Not quickly, not without resistance, but with enough understanding of where they came from and what they were built for. If this felt like someone finally naming what has been running quietly in the background of your life, subscribe, because that's exactly what we do here every single week.